We are going to continue our session. Buenas tardes, señor.
Good afternoon, Mr. Fuentes. Would you please read the witness statement that you have before you?
Señor Fuentes,
Good afternoon. I solemnly declare upon my honor and conscience that I shall speak the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Thank you very much.
Mr. Who is going to? Mr. Foster. Mr. Foster.
Thank you, Mr. President. Welcome back, Mr. Fuentes.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Do you have in front of you the copies of your statements that you've submitted in this arbitration, which are dated January the 25th, 2010, and March the 11th, 2011?
That is correct.
Do you ratify these statements and affirm their truthfulness before the tribunal?
Yes, I do. Both of them.
Thank you. Were you involved in the negotiations that took place between Ferrovias and the government of Guatemala from late August 2006 through October 2006 after the government published the Lesivo Declaration?
Yes, that is correct. Basically, I was a negotiator trying to find a solution that was satisfactory to both parties.
How many of these negotiations between Ferrovias and the government took place after the Lesivo resolution?
As far as I can remember, not more than 4, probably.
During these meetings, did the government ever make a standalone offer to withdraw the declaration of Lesividad in exchange for Ferrovias agreeing to resolve the alleged legal defects in the usufruct equipment contracts?
No.
Mr. President, that's all the questions that I have. And Mr. Fuentes, if you will answer Mr. Orta's questions.
Thank you, Mr. Foster. Mr. Orta.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have one technical issue before we get started, which is I think at the moment we're not able to control the screen for purposes of putting exhibits up. So before you start counting our time, I would ask that we could try to resolve that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Mr. Fuentes.
Buenas tardes, señor Horta.
Good afternoon, Mr. Orta.
I'd like to ask you a series of questions about your 2 declarations. And if I could, I'd like to start with trying to place in context your participation in the events back in 2006 and perhaps earlier. At that time, you were a member of the government, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
You were the National Head Officer of Social Development Projects and Acting Commissioner and Executive Director for the Mega Projects Commission. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Is a commission appointed by President Berger?
Yes, that is correct.
And who did you respond to directly? Who was your immediate supervisor?
The Presidential Commissioner for Mega Projects, appointed by the President of the Republic. Back at that time, his name was Luis Flores Asturias.
Used to be Vice President of Guatemala, correct? In a prior administration?
Yes, he was Vice President under Álvaro Arzú.
In the presidential palace?
No.
No.
Office.
Nosotros estábamos
We were physically located in an office of the Social Investment Fund, FIS. Mr. Flores, apart from being the Presidential Commissioner, was the Executive Director of FIS.
In terms of timing of events and then come back. I just want to make sure I understand the context. You mentioned that on the 23rd of August of 2006, you were named by President Berger to be the acting or head mediator on behalf of the government in order to try and resolve the disputes between the government, FEGUA on the one hand and Ferrovías on the other. Is that correct?
es correcto.
That is correct.
Was that a conversation you had directly with President Berger?
Sobre este nombre
About this appointment?
directamente.
And why he picked you to be the mediator or the chief mediator for the government?
I suppose it was because that perhaps in some ways it was related to the issue of railways, and he knew of my knowledge of the subject.
Knowledge about the railway in Guatemala at that point in time?
Algunos
I knew some details. I'm not an expert. I cannot say that I was an expert. I am not an expert, but I had knowledge on that project, of that project.
To the best of your recollection, exactly what the President said to you when he asked you to be the chief mediator, negotiator on behalf of the government?
I cannot remember his words exactly, but it was something to this effect. Well, after a meeting had been held between both parties, the President told me, well, I'm going to appoint you as the person to negotiate this matter, and you are going to be in charge of this issue.
Did you say anything back to the President at that point?
Yes, of course, I accepted. Yes, Mr. President, I would be pleased to do my best.
The President was asking you at that point in time, we're talking about the 23rd of August 2006, to try and do your best as chief negotiator for the government to reach a resolution of the disputes between the government on the one hand and Ferrovías on the other in relation to the railway?
Yes, that is correct.
Was one of the objectives to reach a resolution of all of the items that were in dispute between the parties at that point?
I don't know what were all the issues there, but I was trying to be the negotiator, the facilitator between Ferrovías and the other government actors that, of course, had to have deep knowledge of all the aspects of the concessions.
Your mission that the President was giving you to try to resolve all of those problems, whether or not you understood at that point what each problem was?
Sí.
Yes, to try and look for a solution that would be satisfactory to both parties in order to find a solution. The problem, I wouldn't be able to pinpoint which, but the problems related to railways.
Did you understand the problem to be that you were being tasked with trying to find a solution for?
Well, I don't think there was a will from both parties to define which the problem was, or rather what the problem was. The idea was to try for the railway to continue being operational and not to take subsequent decisions, and we know because of evidence what happened later.
Is your objective to try to reach a resolution in order to avoid the publication of the executive resolution of Lesivo?
At the time, I had never learned about this Lesivo. I had no idea that that could take place. What I was trying to do is to facilitate an agreement between both parties. I repeat, this issue of Lesivo I had no knowledge of, and I didn't know the details of each one of the contracts that make up the onerous usufruct.
Just to make sure that you understand my question, I'm not asking if you know or at that point were aware of all of the technical or legal issues associated with the Lesivo Declaration. Rather, I'm asking whether at that time, when the President asked you to be the chief negotiator on behalf of the government, were you aware that the President had signed a Lesivo Declaration at that point?
This was the meeting of the 23rd of August. I had not an absolute certainty that it had been signed. I knew that it was coming, and if I remember correctly, this happened the very next day.
Did the President say anything else to you?
No.
Other than that conversation that you had with President Berger on the 23rd of August that you've just described for us, did you have any other conversations with President Berger regarding the disputes between Ferrovías and Fegua?
Before or after?
Go first with prior to that date.
Before the date, yes. When I was involved in one of the meetings, I had the possibility of discussing this issue without going into the details of what was going on exactly. I was letting the President know that there was a very interesting project and we should pay all the attention in the world to it, so that we could go ahead and develop the railway in the different stages, because we felt that this would greatly behoove the country. So these were my comments in some meetings. The meetings were not specifically geared at this issue, but the President was present at those meetings. So the President knew that I was related to the issue of railways and that I had knowledge about some aspects. So if you're asking that, the answer is yes.
About the importance of the railway for the country, did you have any other discussions prior to that 23rd of August?
Perdón, no tenía sonido. ¿Podría repetirme la pregunta?
Sure. Other than the conversation that you just described for us, or conversations that you described for us that you had with the President prior to the 23rd of August 2006 in relation to the importance of the railway project for the country, did you have any other discussions with President Berger prior to the 23rd of August in relation to the railway project and or any disputes between the government, Fegua on the one hand, and Ferrovías on the other?
Perhaps I didn't make myself clear. at some point in time, and I don't remember the dates, and this was not a formal meeting, this was not an official meeting to deal with this issue, well, the president knew that I was somewhat involved in trying to provide support to the development of the railway project. This project was never a mega project that was assigned to us, so officially it was not. But because of its strategic importance for the country, I was, let's say, exposed to information, mainly from Ferrovías and in very few occasions from the executing unit of this project, which is the Ministry of Infrastructure and Housing and the Department of Railways. Well, we don't really have a Department of Railways, but it is FEGWA.
The conversations that you had with the president, they were limited to the issues that you just discussed? The conversation before the 23rd of August?
Yes, basically, they were about the fact that this issue was very important for the country, and apparently the parties cannot reach an agreement. So, without going into further detail.
23rd of August, did you have any conversations with President Berger in relation to the disputes between Ferrovías and FEGWA?
Yes, let me look at the date just to make sure.
Sí,
Yes, I tried to contact the president on the 24th when the events were imminent, but unfortunately the president was unable to talk to me, so I was referred to the secretary, to the general secretary.
Secretary General of the President on the 24th of August in a little bit, but any other conversations with President Berger in relation to these issues?
On the 24th or the 23rd?
no.
No.
After the 24th of August, 2006?
Probablemente.
Probably some telephone call just for me to know what else I could do to try and solve this problem that had already ensued. Probably, yeah.
Conversation at all? Of that conversation you say may have happened?
No, I don't. Basically, as of the declaration of Lesivo, well, there was no need for a ratification of the appointment or the responsibilities. Of my own accord, I tried to bring the parties together to see whether a resolution could have been reached for the parties to agree amongst themselves.
The publication of the Lesivo Declaration on the...
Pardon me. Sí, su pregunta es.
What's the question again?
The meetings that did occur after the publication of the Lesivo Declaration, and I'm referencing in particular the meetings that began on the 28th of August 2006, the first business day after the Lesivo Declaration was published. Was the President aware that you were holding those meetings?
Probably yes, because the government officials with whom I met were officials of his administration, specifically from the Ministry of Communications. But there was no major contact on my part with the President. The message had been given already. It was look, let's see if you can do something.
The instructions had already been given. You understood that you should continue to try to find a way to seek a resolution of the disputes between Ferrovías and FEGUA on behalf of the government, even after the Lesivo Declaration had been published?
Yes, of course. If the contrary had been the case, you rest assured that the president would have told me, do nothing else. So I understood that I should have to make an effort, and this would be positive for the country.
Other than President Berger, were there any other high-level government officials that you had discussions with about the problems between Ferrovías and FEGUA?
Are you talking about a specific meeting or at any point in time?
Fair point. We know that you had several conversations with some folks that attended some of these meetings, which we're going to talk about in a second. But, for example, did you have access to were you speaking with the private secretary of the president at any point about these issues?
The private secretary or the general secretary?
En relación a este tema,
In connection with this issue?
Sir.
no recuerdo haber tenido ninguna.
I don't remember holding a meeting with the private secretary in connection with this issue.
Conversation you described in your declaration that you had with the Secretary General, Mr. Arroyave, did you have any other discussions with him about these issues?
De nuevo, mi pregunta.
Again, my question is before or after or at any point in time?
Other than the one that you had on the 24th of August, did you have any other discussions with Mr. Arroyave about these issues?
No, con el,
Not with Mr. Arroyave. I didn't hold any conversations with him. Any other conversations with him.
Conversations with, well, let me strike that and try a different question. Have you ever met Mr. Ramon Campollo?
¿Yo?
Me, personally? In connection with this issue?
Oh.
Yo al señor Ramón Campos.
I know Mr. Ramon Campollo. Yes, of course I do. But not when I was in the government. I know him from way back in time.
Issues in relation to the railway?
No, nunca.
No, never.
You know a gentleman by the name of Hector Pinto? Or did you know a gentleman by the name of Hector Pinto?
Yes. Yes, I did meet him.
To him about any issues in relation to the railway?
Yes, yes. He came to me at some point in time. I don't remember the date exactly. But I remember it was during Mr. Berger's administration when Mr. Berger was president. And when I was holding my first post, not the negotiation post, but the post that had to do with social projects. And he asked me to meet with him. He came to my office to find information about the mega projects, what these mega projects were, and if railways were included in the mega projects. And I answered the same thing that I answered to you. This is not one of the four issues that the president assigned to us. But because of the nature of this issue and because of the dimension of it, it can be considered a mega project. And then the conversation went on to finding out what the line would be of our government related to this issue. And we said, well, there are plans. There is a concession given to RDC and under Ferrovías de Guatemala, and this is the current situation. And he insisted, what else? How can we expedite things. And my answer to him was, why? Why are you interested? What is your interest based on? I knew perfectly well how the sugar industry works and where it operates in Guatemala. So it was very logical and very natural for him to try and obtain information related to this issue. But my answers were always related to the fact that there was a concession, there was a company, and, well, the policies of the government are to be set forth by the Ministry of Communications. And the Ministry of Communications has to support steadfastly everything that the government of Guatemala is ready to support for those contracts to be enforced and for the development and for the railway to be developed as we have wished at all times.
No, I don't. I need to think about it very carefully, but I can only tell you that it must have been by the end of the first year of the administration. That would be 2004? End of late 2004, early 2005. But I am not certain. And unfortunately, he is no longer here to be able to ask him.
Other than that one conversation with Mr. Pinto about the railway, did you have any other conversations with him about that topic?
Telefónico.
By phone, twice or three times, he was conducting some sort of follow-up to see how the issue was developing and trying to see whether someone... I imagine that his interest was to be sure and certain whether someone within the administration of Mr. President Berger was managing that issue in particular. And my answer was always the same. It is not one of the mega projects that has been assigned to our responsibility. My suggestion is to resort to the relevant place, and that would be the Ministry of Communications, Infrastructure and Housing.
Telephone conversations that you just described and the one in-person meeting that you described, did you have any other conversations with Mr. Pinto about that topic?
We could have exchanged emails. I do not remember. Email messages, I do not remember, but there might have been a couple of them, but I don't remember. Do you have any idea about how it is developing? Do you have any information? Things of that sort. Yes. In connection with Mr. Pinto, yes.
Okay. Let's talk about the... let's talk about before the 24th of August, 2006. You mentioned in your first declaration and in particular in paragraph 6 of your first declaration. If we could put that up, Kelby. In the second sentence, you say that throughout the years 2004 and 2006, I had several meetings with representatives of FEG with regard to the development and investment opportunities in connection with the project. And then you say all of which were suspended in August 2006 as a result of the Lesivo declaration by the government of Guatemala. Is that an accurate statement?
La del...
The one from paragraph 6?
I just read.
Yes, it is correct. I met with them several times prior to what happened.
Of those meetings that you had with Ferrovías between 2004 and 2006.
Yo me imagino que
I imagine that similarly to what happened with Mr. Pinto. Mr. Sen, who was General Assistant Manager, was very interested in the subject matter that our office was conducting, that is the Mega Project Office, and I'm sure you're going to understand. And let me give you some context. When we refer to mega projects in our country, is something gigantic, something that is striking, but there weren't that many. There were 4 significant projects, but the president had decided to commission them to very specific personalities, such as my boss, González Arturias. Some people approach our office, such as Mr. Sen and Mr. Pinto, and with many other projects that have nothing to do with the original 4 projects, to try and find support for the project. I would say that explanation should clarify quite well why we had a relationship with Ferrovías.
Were the subject of the conversations you had with Ferrovías all or primarily all conducted through Mr. Sen?
Fundamental.
Primarily.
Discussions with Mr. Posner ever before this legal case started?
I had the honor to meet Mr. Posner once, and I knew through Mr. Sen of possible future plans to be developed, and once again, many people, including foreigners, approached our office to find out about the railway and what the situation was. These were people who at some point in time had expressed their potential interest as investors or shareholders. They just wanted to explore the situation. My role back then was basically to meet them. I know you. I know some of the details. I know the strategic vision of the railway project, and in particular, I think it is fantastic. And I would say that it is very easy to establish contact among the parties so that they can explore other possibilities, but nothing beyond that.
Juan Esteban Berger, the son of the former President Berger?
Sí, claro.
Yes, of course, I know him.
Have you ever had any discussions with Juan Esteban Berger in relation to the disputes between Ferrovías and FEWA?
Absoluto.
No. That's correct. I said no.
Jorge Sen, that Mr. Campollo, through the efforts of Juan Esteban Berger, was concocting some claims about illegalities related to the usufruct agreements that Ferrovías had?
Me parece que esa.
I think that is a very sensitive statement, and my answer is absolutely not.
Anyone else at FEG, or did you ever make that statement to anyone else at FEG? At Ferrovías, excuse me?
Que Juan Esteban y el.
That Juan Esteban and Mr. Campollo were preparing Plan B. Is that your question?
Mr. Berger, on behalf of Mr. Campollo, was speaking with the government to create some illegalities or concoct some illegalities associated with the usufruct contracts that Ferrovías had.
Oh, déjeme aclarar.
Let me clarify two issues and then I respond your question, and if I fail to do so, please ask me again. First of all, the railroad issue in Guatemala is something public. Any official or any business person may refer to this. This is not forbidden. And if there have been some strategic interests by some groups, for example, by the sugar sector, this is not a secret. And if you knew the context in Guatemala, the sugar industry is very aggressive in the positive sense of the word. It is ahead of the game. They always wanted to be present, and clearly there are some parallel situations when we think of means of transportation that is of low cost and low social impact. So if that was the case, that is not a state secret, and I can guarantee to you that you do not need me to do that. And the question was whether I told someone beyond Ferrovías about that. No, I didn't. That is irrelevant to me. Look, there is someone who's interested in the railroad issue. Yes, of course, the sugar sector people, but to mention the name of Mr. Berger, whom I know, and that was not the case. And I did not have a meeting on that with any of the members from Ferrovías.
Mr. President, I object to the entire line of questioning about this alleged conversation. That's not in his statement. It goes beyond his statement and beyond anything he testified to on direct.
Mr. Horta?
Could we, I'd rather not give you the answer in front of the witness. May I have a sidebar?
Yeah, sure.
So can we go off the record for a second?
So the objection of Mr. Forster is denied, but at the same time, as a general matter in situations as has been explained by the council, I mean, we will allow questioning that may refer to other witnesses' statements.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Fuentes, I'll take you back to that meeting of the 23rd of August, 2006. You mentioned that before the president gave you the mandate to be the chief negotiator for the government, he or you had attended a meeting wherein persons from Ferrovías and the government had been had participated. Is that correct?
Yes, the answer is correct.
Do you recall who from Ferrovías was at that meeting?
At least I remember Mr. Jorge Sen.
Recall whether Mr. Campoyo's name was mentioned during that meeting?
No, no.
No, it was not mentioned.
What was the purpose of that meeting, to your recollection?
Once again, it was to discuss at the highest possible level the interest, but mostly the concern of the company represented by Mr. Sen, Ferrovías, in connection with the slow performance and the lack of cooperation and information by the government on the railway issue.
They're stating to the government?
More than Mr. Sen, I would say that I said that. That was my interpretation. Those were my words about and my understanding of what Mr. Sen had shared with me.
And what do you recall to be the president's reaction? What did he say during that meeting, to the best of your recollection?
The president was always characterized for being a very optimistic person and a supportive person to the project, and I could understand his words as well as his reaction to be positive, saying we are going to go ahead with the project.
Recollection, did the president make any demands on Ferrovías and Mr. Sen during that meeting on the 23rd of August?
I don't know whether the word demand in English and in Spanish is the same, but I would say that the president made them see that his understanding in this issue, that it was not very deep, was that the plans for the various phases had not been developed, and as I understand now, they are in the concession program and that they had not been developed as expected, and that was his concern and interest.
Did the president say anything else to Mr. Sen during that meeting?
I don't remember. But I think I mentioned the most important part.
3rd of August, do you recall attending a meeting with other members of the government in order to prepare for a meeting with Ferrovías the next day?
Que yo,
Now, the issue of that I met with representatives from the government to prepare that meeting?
no,
No, I don't remember having met just with one party. My meetings were always with both parties.
With, for example, anyone from the Ministry of the Communications later on the 23rd of August?
As I said, just with members of the work team from the Communications Ministry, no, I do not remember.
Of August that you mentioned in your declarations, at which there were members of the government and also Ferrovías attended, correct?
Es correcto.
That is correct.
To prepare for that meeting?
No, I didn't just try to fulfill my duty as a mediator.
Now, during that meeting, you discuss it in your declarations. During that meeting, the government presented a draft of a settlement agreement to Ferrovías, correct?
I wouldn't call it a settlement agreement. I would say that it was a set of demands that the government, in this case, based on or through the Ministry of Communications, was stating to Ferrovías so as not to continue with the process.
The chief person on behalf of the government at that meeting, given the mandate you had from the president?
In my humble mind, I could have thought so, but that was not the case. Once again, I was trying to be a negotiator between two parties that had something less than an agreement. I would say that they had a disagreement.
Put into the draft settlement document that was given to Ferrovías on the 24th of August?
Absolutely not.
If you could put up C-44 for me, please. And while we're getting the document up, it's in case you would like to see it in Spanish. The document is also in your binder behind tab C-44 in Spanish.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Go to the... Well, first of all, just so that you understand what I'm showing you, this is a document that was submitted in this case by claimant, and they have said this is the written document that they were handed on the 24th of August, 2006. And if we could go to clause number 3, please. And in this clause, first of all, it's titled The Settlement. The Spanish version says De la Transacción. And in clause A of this third article of the draft agreement, the parties are proposing that, or the government, I guess, was proposing that Ferrovías desist from its arbitration cases that had been filed, correct?
No sé, este es un documento en el que yo...
I don't know. This is a document that didn't have my participation.
The document earlier as a series of demands, I think you said. You said exigencies or demands.
Este documento.
Yes, sir.
This document?
That was presented to Ferrovías by the government on the 24th of August, 2006. You were just characterizing it a second ago.
Ah, okay.
Yes, I understood now. This is a document that was already prepared by someone. I did not participate in its drafting, and it was just shown at some point during the meeting, and it was mentioned. I was not the one who read it or was not aware of it. I could read it but I couldn't tell you what it is about because, once again, I am not an expert and it was not part of my duty, and I was never in charge of that either. So I was just trying to have one party was presenting a document to the other party that was Ferrovias, and I was trying to see whether the relationship was adverse or it was positive, or whether an agreement could be reached. But I cannot share an opinion about this. And
all the points in the document. The tribunal can see it for itself. I do want to take you, though, to a few of the clauses just to point something out. If you go to Clause 4, please, and just highlight all the language that you can there that's in, there you go, in Clause 4. And you, sir, if you prefer, can look at the Spanish version, but you can see that in this document it talks about issues to be negotiated between the parties, correct?
Puntos a negociar en cuanto.
Points or issues to be negotiated in connection with the terms of the onerous usufruct contract involving.
Fast for the record, but my question is just, it talks about issues to be negotiated between the parties in relation to the rail-of-way contract, correct? The right-of-way contract.
No puedo asegurarlo.
I can't say for sure, but because I'm not familiar with it, I didn't read this document at that meeting. It was just presented, it was read by the representatives of Ferrovias, and after that, the meeting had to be canceled because no agreement was reached.
Whether, when this document was handed over by first of all, did you hand this document over, or did somebody else do it during the meeting to Ferrovias?
Este documento.
This document?
Este documento nunca pasó por.
No, this document never came through my hands. Somebody else must have presented it and delivered it to Ferrovias, and that occurred as you indicate.
When it was given to Ferrovias, do you recall if they made any counter proposals? Did they engage in efforts to negotiate some of the terms of this agreement during that meeting?
No.
No effort was made to negotiate. And engineer Sen, Mr. Sen, said that he did not have the authority or the power to be able to make a decision at that time, and that definitively that was the end of the meeting.
Was it your hope that the parties were going to be able to reach agreement on the terms of this document or some other, so as to be able to avoid the publication of the Lesivo Declaration?
Yo no podría decir.
I couldn't say that I had the hope that they would get into some negotiation about this document, because once again, I'm not familiar with this document. I don't understand this document, nor was it my obligation, based on my position at that time, to know of any detail of this document. This document surely must contain aspects related to the clauses of the contracts between them, which is not my work. It never was. What I wanted was to try to say, is there some way that both the government and you can reach agreement? Yes or no? And the answer at that time is what I already said. No, we can't. We don't have the power. And judging based on what I'm looking at, it's a document that you can't just read it and make a decision on it in 5 minutes.
Mr. Sen communicated to the government officials there and yourself that he didn't have authority to negotiate this agreement. Do you recall if he stepped out of the room to make a call to Mr. Posner or Mr. Duggan or anyone else?
No.
No, I don't remember those details.
Now, sir, to the meeting notes from the meetings that took place after the publication of the Lesivo Declaration. And in particular, I want to take you now to Exhibit R36. Again, we're putting the English version of the document up on the system. I would ask that you look at the Spanish version so that you're clear on what the document says. And the first question is, did you prepare these notes, these meeting notes?
No, no.
No, I don't think it was me who prepared them.
On the first page of Exhibit R36, there's an introductory paragraph that basically says, I'm paraphrasing, but that a discussion table was set up on Monday, August 28, 2006, following the President's declaration of Lesivo on August 25, 2006. Do you remember that that was, in essence, the purpose of the meeting, to try to continue to sit down after the President's publishing of the Lesivo Declaration to see if the parties could reach a negotiated solution to their problems?
Sí.
Yes.
I want to, first of all, you were at this meeting, correct? You called the meeting, actually? You're the one who called it?
Es correcto.
That is correct.
Is that you were there by appointment of the President to try to coordinate a settlement between the parties?
Ellos ya tenían.
They already knew that ahead of time because this was after the declaration of lesividad, so there was no need for me to say so. I think that both parties gave me the benefit of the doubt of saying, let's try, let's see if we can still do something.
Attention to point number 3 under the heading of Monday, August 28. First question is, this meeting was in fact held on Monday, August 28, to your recollection, the first meeting?
Creería que sí.
I would think so.
Under point number 3, it says, it is public information that on the same day, all the newspapers in the country published Ferrovia's paid advertisement space. You see that?
Sí, sí, leo el tercer.
Yes, I can read that. I read the third point, but what I cannot say for sure is whether on August 28th, whether that was the day that Ferrovia's paid ad came out. I don't remember, but that's very easy to check because it's in the media, or there will be evidence as to what day the paid ad by Ferrovias was published.
Paul, or not, if what is reported here is accurate, that on that day, all of the newspapers published Ferrovia's paid advertisement. Do you recall generally that there were discussions at that first meeting about the fact that Ferrovias was speaking to the public, to the media, about the Lesivo Declaration?
No puedo.
I cannot say that. What I can tell you with absolute certainty is that all of the media in Guatemala were aware that there was a problem between the parties. And there were publications practically every day in the media of what one or the other of the actors had to say. That is to say, opinions by the government as well as opinions by Ferrovias. But I wouldn't dare to affirm exactly what you're saying.
If we could look at the last point with respect to the Monday, August 28th meeting notes, it says, the participants in the table communicated, I'm going to take liberties here and fix the translation, to the manager of Ferrovias, that it was not appropriate for the company to resort to media outlets to express their opinions on the process while a discussion table was being held. Do you recall generally that there were requests to Mr. Sen to refrain from making communications to the press on behalf of Ferrovias because the parties were still sitting down trying to negotiate a resolution?
Sí, sí.
Yes, that's right. And it seemed fair to me, in addition.
With respect to the substantive issues that were discussed, during the meeting. There are a number of them listed under point number 5. And I want to draw your attention to the fourth bullet point, the one just above the one we were just reading. And that one says that one of the points to be discussed, or that was discussed during that meeting, was evaluating the execution of a new contract for usufruct of railroad equipment, considering the Lesivo declaration of the previous contract. Do you recall that that was one of the issues discussed during the meeting, as reported in these minutes?
Quisiera
I'd like to say yes, but I'm not certain of just what the points were. They talked about 3 contracts, but I don't remember any of them in particular, by which I don't mean to say this didn't happen. It's simply not something that I'm on top of that would allow me to say with absolute certainty, yes, that was one of the issues discussed.
Going to the next meeting, which was held on Wednesday, August 30th, same document, if you can just go down a little bit, Kelby. This was an internal meeting at which it says you were in attendance, and that occurred on Wednesday, August 30th, and at which the Attorney General of Guatemala attended, as well as yourself and others in the government, correct?
Sí, es correcto.
Yes, that is correct.
And in relation to point number 3, do you recall that the Attorney General stated during that meeting that he would hold off filing any legal actions relating to the Lesivo Declaration in order to give the parties time to hold the negotiation meetings that you were attending, or that you were chairing?
Sí, correcto.
Yes, that's right.
If you look at the last point on Wednesday, August 30th, you state there that, or it states there, excuse me, that you said during that meeting that you were aware of the fact that Ferrovias had scheduled a press conference for the following day, that would be Thursday, August 31, and that the American Embassy, AmCham, and other institutions had been invited to attend the press conference. Do you recall making that observation during that meeting?
Sí.
Yes.
To the next Friday, September 8th set of meeting notes. This meeting was held in your office, according to the minutes. Do you recall that?
Sí.
Yes. Yes, I do remember.
Number of issues discussed, but I just want to call your attention to topic number 6, which is actually on the next page. At least according to the minutes, one of the topics that was discussed was the possibility of a new contract for the railroad equipment, and it says here that FEGWA suggested that a new contract should be drafted to correct the deficiencies which motivated the Lesivo Declaration, and that no reference was made to the deficiencies as a strategy of the government. Do you see that?
El punto 6, sí.
Point 6, yes, I see it here.
At that meeting, this issue came up just as in the prior meeting?
Igual que en la reunión anterior.
Just as in the prior meeting, I can't assure you, but at this meeting, probably yes. They were touching on more specific issues.
There was no reference made to the deficiencies as a strategy of the government. Do you have any idea what that is a reference to, since you were the chief negotiator there for the government?
No.
No. No, I didn't have technical knowledge of the details. I just know that as between the two of them, there were differences as to whether or not to take up certain points of the contracts, but I don't know what each of them refers to when they mention it. And I didn't do this.
Now reference R37,
Before you pass to R37, would you mind to say what's the date of this document?
The date of the document that's on the
one that's on
yes.
the screen.
So this is R36, and this is a series of meeting minutes from these meetings that took place after the Lesivo Declaration. I don't know the date that the document was created, but it reflects on or records meeting notes from these various meetings that took place. I just want to make, I know I only have about 2.5 minutes. I just want to make sure the time isn't running against me for these questions, because I just have a couple of topics.
We said at one point that the questions of the tribunal will not be counted on your time, as part of your time, and you are correct. You have about 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Obviously not against your time either. There was another meeting note at the bottom, I think September 13th. Do you intend to go through that? It would be useful for the tribunal, since you're giving us all of the meetings, to just, is that the last meeting that for which there are notes? Because just for our own edification, it would be useful to at least give us a second to look at that without counting against your time.
Sure, I'm happy to take them through it, and then do the R37, which I think is also.
If you don't mind, and that won't, since it's you're responding to my question, that won't count against your time.
Yes, sir. So if we could put, so we still have R36 up on the screen. If we could go to Mr. Fuentes, the meeting dated, or at least the notes of the meeting that took place on the 13th of September 2006. Now, first of all, you were in attendance at that meeting, correct?
A la reunión perdón, estábamos.
Excuse me, we were on the October 4th?
36, the document that we were just looking at, and in particular focusing you on the meeting notes from the meeting that took place on the 13th of September 2006.
Okay, la tengo acá.
Okay, I've got it here.
And in the, first of all, in this meeting you were in attendance, correct?
Sí, es correcto.
Yes, that's correct.
It states under point number 3 that there are a series of issues that were discussed between the parties, and it says it was basically the same substantive issues that had been discussed in the prior meetings, correct?
Básicamente sí.
Basically, yes, the ones that are set forth in these notes.
Topics were discussed during that meeting, including the issue of a new contract for the usufruct of the railroad equipment.
Abordar los temas en particular.
In terms of the issues having been gotten into, no, they were just raised.
Don't remember whether they were discussed. Or are you saying something different?
Recuerdo.
I remember that they were not developed one by one in detail at the session. I remember they were set down to be taken up, but they were not technical sessions, but rather negotiating sessions.
In relation to, for example, the issue of the trust agreement, do you recall that Mr. Sen made a counter proposal to a proposal that FEGWA had made, in which he suggested that a fixed annual amount be contributed by FEGWA rather than a percentage of FEGWA's income?
No recuerdo.
I don't remember the details. I'm sorry, but it's not. It's a highly technical issue in which we're negotiating the interests of both.
Speaking in these meetings, the parties were discussing reprogramming the rehabilitation phases of the railway.
Sí, en algún momento.
Yes, at some point in time there was discussion of those issues.
I've reviewed the meeting notes very carefully, and I would invite you to do the same, but you did say in your second witness statement that during these meetings, the government asked, and let me, I don't want to misrepresent what you said.
Please just refer him to the paragraph you're referring to.
Right, I'm trying to find it, Alan. Okay. Paragraph 9 of your second witness declaration. Mr. Fuentes, you say that during these meetings that the government officials tried to have Ferrovias sign a settlement agreement whereby the company would surrender a considerable part of its rights as a usufructuary of real property, just like they did the day before the publication of the Declaration of Lesividad. I will represent to you, I have carefully looked through these meeting notes, and at least in the meeting notes, there's no representation that such a demand was ever made during these meetings. Do you have a recollection that, notwithstanding that the meeting notes don't refer to it, that such a demand was made?
But I don't know if it was in this meeting of 13 September, but what I do remember is that the government had a position saying, sign, 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 and the problem will be all over. And that's what I tried to express in my previous point in response to your previous question, that Mr. Sen didn't feel that he was empowered or had the authority to be able to do that at that time.
Sign it. What is it you're referring to? Are you talking about the document that I showed you before, the C-44 draft settlement? Or was there some other document?
As I say, these are not documents that I had before me. These are documents that the parties would exchange. So I cannot respond in the affirmative because I don't have personal knowledge of it.
Confusion is that when you look at the meeting notes, nowhere do they say that a settlement draft was put before Mr. Sen.
I object,
Let me
Mr.
just
President.
finish
No, I don't want you to finish until I can get my objection out. Mr. Orta is trying to testify. If he wants to ask the witness, can you find these words in the meeting notes, that's a perfectly proper question. But what he's saying is what he reads in the meeting notes, and that's not a proper question.
Could you rephrase the question?
Certainly, Mr. Chairman. Can you tell me where in the meeting notes it says that a draft agreement was given to Ferrovias and that the government made a demand that Ferrovias sign it?
¿En qué reunión?
Yes.
In which meeting?
¿En cuál? ¿De qué fecha?
Well, I'm asking you
For which date?
meeting notes, and I don't see it anywhere, so I'm asking you to show me when that happened, or tell me when that happened.
En mi segunda declaración.
In my second statement, let's see if I'm understanding, because I'm a bit confused, Mr. Orta. In the second statement, at paragraph 3, paragraph 5, we make allusion to the 24 August meeting. Is that the one you're referring to?
I'm talking about paragraph 9 of
Okay,
your
de las
second.
posteriores.
Yes,
The subsequent ones.
9, okay.
right.
Paragraph 9.
Un momento, por favor.
Just a moment, please.
Habla de varias reuniones posteriores a la...
It speaks of several meetings after the Declaration of Lesividad. Is that right?
El punto 9.
So your point is 9.
Esto es lo que yo escuché.
This is what I heard. What I say at 9. I heard that was the intent of the government to sign, as I put in my statement, to sign a settlement agreement in which it would surrender a considerable part of its acquired rights as usufructuary of real property, just like they did the day before the publication of the Declaration of Lesividad, If you are reading, could you please read a little more slowly for the interpreter? I'm sorry, yes. I'm going to read just the relevant paragraph.
What I'm asking you for is the meeting notes. If you can point to us where in the meeting notes it's reflected that the government made a demand, as you say here in paragraph 9, that Ferrovias sign a settlement agreement whereby the company would surrender a considerable part of its rights as a usufructuary of real property. And in particular, you're referring to the meetings that took place after the declaration of lesividad, and these are the meeting notes from that meeting.
Okay, yo no tengo ese documento.
I don't have that document. I didn't have it. That was a document that was presented by the government counterpart to them directly to ask if they agreed with that. And one could end or resolve the dispute between the government and Ferrovias, to which Ferrovias responded after reading it. But I didn't have it before me. I did not read, nor am I familiar with the contents of it, more than what was mentioned in general terms.
Proposal? Or did they just say they didn't have authority to sign anything?
En esa reunión, no.
At that meeting, no. Ferrovias was just trying to ask what were the problems, or what were the reasons why they had not been able to go forward. The two positions were always, you haven't performed on all counts. And Ferrovias would say, it's not that I haven't performed on everything. I have performed on some points. The points that I've not performed on, well, it's because the government of Guatemala, and not necessarily just the administration of President Pinochet, but the prior administrations as well, that is to say the government of Guatemala, has not complied with all of its, what is it is committed to. That's where the conversations bogged down.
I sense that is satisfied in terms of his question. So you have 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, sir.
To complete the examination.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to now turn your attention to R37. And again, there's a Spanish version of the document in front of you as well. It's behind the blue tab. And this is a set of meeting notes referring to a meeting that took place on the 4th of October, 2006. Do you recall, first of all, it says the meeting took place in your office?
Sí, sí.
Yes, I do remember. That's correct.
That the purpose of the meeting, at least as reflected in the meeting notes, was to hear the opinion of Ferrovias regarding proposals that had been made by FEGUA?
Al menos en...
At least in general terms, yes.
Do you recall, I think as you state in your second declaration, that one of the things that Mr. Sen said during this meeting is that, and I'm going to take you to the heading that says contract number 143, usufruct of railroad equipment, declared lesivo to state interest by President of the Republic. Do you see that?
Sí, estoy leyendo.
Yes, I am reading it.
Do you recall that Mr. Sen said that during that meeting, that he didn't think it was advisable to draft a new contract for the usufruct railroad equipment without having in-depth knowledge of the legal causes for the lesivo declaration? Do you remember him saying that?
Sí.
Yes.
You also recall that he said that he found that the amendment of the contract would be of secondary priority in view of the plans to change the railroad system to wide gauge?
Sí, no solamente...
Yes. Not just, well, I can't say precisely in that meeting, but I do remember the arguments, and that is one of the arguments that sounds very familiar to me, based on the conversations I had throughout the process with Mr. Sen.
Did the President ever instruct you to demand $50 million from Ferrovías in exchange for withdrawing the Lesivo Declaration?
El presidente de la República.
The President of the Republic?
Yes.
Me?
La pregunta, por favor.
Can you repeat the question, please?
President Berger, did he ever instruct you to demand $50 million from Ferrovías in order to withdraw the Lesivo Declaration?
Jamás.
Never.
Mr. Horta, I think we're out of time.
And as with yesterday, it's very fortuitous because I'm done. Thank you, sir.
This is perfect. Good timing. So, Mr. Foster.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Fuentes, you've been looking at all these meeting notes for meetings that were held after the declaration of Lesivo. Did you have anything to do with the preparation of these notes?
I don't think so. I never signed my name with a title, so this shows clearly that I did not prepare these documents. I don't know if I'm making myself clear.
Yes, you are. You're very clear. Did you receive a copy of these meeting notes at the time the meetings were occurring?
No.
Do you know whether or not these meeting notes were ever given to Ferrovías? Meetings were occurring.
I have no personal knowledge of that.
At all of these meetings, did the government ever make an offer simply to renegotiate the terms of the contract in order to eliminate the legal technicalities and problems that had caused Lesivo?
No.
Was the government's offer always coupled with demands for a rescheduling of the rehabilitation phases and resolution of the contributions of FEGUA to the trust fund?
Those are the points on which I can clearly remember things. The interest of the government was fundamentally to find out what happens. Why isn't the line operational? Why isn't the railway working? And the issue of the money.
Now, let's go back to your meeting on August the 23rd with the President when he asked you to serve as the mediator to try to resolve the differences between the government and Ferrovías. At that meeting, did he tell you that he was going to issue the Lesivo resolution if Ferrovías did not agree to a government proposal the next day?
No.
Did he tell you that the proposal was going to be a take-it-or-leave-it proposal?
Who, the president?
No.
To me? No.
When you were present at the meeting on August the 24th when this written document was given to Ferrovías by the government, correct?
Yes, an employee of the Ministry of Communications.
And had you ever seen that document before you went to that meeting?
Absolutely not.
Did the government ever indicate during that meeting that it was willing to renegotiate the contract, the equipment contract, to eliminate the technical deficiencies which had caused Lesivo without also insisting on other conditions?
I don't remember exactly, but I would believe that was the thing that we're most interested in.
Was the other conditions as opposed to the technical difficulties?
Las otras condiciones.
The other conditions, yes.
At that meeting, did the government ever tell Ferrovias that Ferrovias had any opportunity, had any alternative other than simply accepting the proposal in its entirety?
No.
No.
Thank you, Mr. Fuentes. That's all the questions I have.
Thank you, Mr. Foster.
Muchas gracias.
Mr. Crawford, Professor Crawford has some questions. It's two of the questions. Also.
I want to take you to paragraph 12 of your first statement, which describes the meeting you had with the acting Secretary General of the Presidency on I think it was the 24th of August of 2006. At that point in time, what did you understand were the government's reasons for regarding the contract as invalidated by lesividad?
Clearly, what I understood is that there was some kind of strategy
Perjudicar o afectar uno de los
to harm or impair one of the three contracts that will bring down with it the other two contracts. And therefore, Ferrovias would not have been able to meet the obligations under the concession as previously agreed. I didn't agree with the fact that we needed to declare lesivo. I felt that negotiations could have ensued between the parties and continued between the parties to try and meet the agreements and the obligations thereunder. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Not quite, although what you say is interesting, but it wasn't the point I was getting at. What did you understand that the government said? I'm not interested so much in their strategy as in the basis on which they were acting from a legal point of view. What were the deficiencies in the equipment contract that, in the government's view, justified the declaration of lesividad?
Mr. Crawford, as I indicated during my statement, I am not a lawyer and I am not a technical person in railway matters. My role was never to understand the content of the three contracts. If you ask me today what is the content of those three contracts, I would be pressed to give you an answer. What I understood out of the meeting was quite clear. There was a declaration of lesivo. It was imminent, and they were not ready to back down.
You say that in this paragraph that you disagreed with the view that the contracts were tainted by lesividad. Is that right?
I don't really understand your question. Could you please repeat it?
You told the Secretary General that you considered the arguments expressed by him to justify the lesividad declaration were contrary to the interests of the country. Could you explain that a little more?
Sí, con mucho gusto.
I'd be glad to. in easier terms, we could say we can leave behind a deadline that had been established to declare lesivo, as expressed to me by Secretary Arroyabe, in order to overcome this and reach a solution that could give rise to the development of the railway project.
You say in the second part of this paragraph that the government had a strategy, in effect, to strike down the whole of the 3 contracts by attacking one of them. But that didn't happen, did it? If that was their strategy, it didn't work. Is that right?
I wouldn't say that. I think that the declaration of lesivo is enough to prevent the company from continue operating. I always understood that the 3 contracts were an indivisible being. One could not be separated from the other. If I grant the usufruct of property, and there are 3 parties to that, or 3 parts to that rather, and then I take away one of those parts, then things cannot go forward. I'm not an expert in these agreements, as I said before, but I understood at the time that if one fell, the other would also fall, and the railway project could no longer be operational.
Mucho gusto.
My pleasure.
Secretary Eisenstadt has a few questions.
Mr. Fuentes, if I may take you back to your first statement. In paragraph 7, you mentioned on May 11, this is several months before the lesivo declaration, that you called Mr. Sen to report information that you had recently heard from a reputable source that the government was planning on issuing a declaration of lesividad, and that the signatures of the ministers were in the process of being collected. So permit me to ask you a few questions about that. First, and if I may, for simplicity purposes, list them all, and then first, do you remember from whom you heard that? Second, did you know the nature of the deficiencies or basis and which contracts they would pertain to? Third, and you say in paragraph 8 you didn't specify whether it had started, but what was his reaction? What was Mr. Sen's reaction to your disclosure to him?
I missed the third question. Who said it? Which the deficiencies were?
Mr. Sen's reactions to your comment.
Son solo 3 preguntas.
So it's just 3 questions that you're posing to me. 3 questions.
Particular
Sí.
paragraph.
Sí. Voy a empezar con la primera.
I'm going to answer the first. How did I find out? I was informed by a high-ranking government official. I'm not going to disclose my source, and this is not relevant, and I said before, and it's fully trustworthy. And this indeed was what happened. Second, what I told him, what I told Mr. Sun, well, I couldn't have reported the details and deficiencies of what was going to happen because I did not know those items. I alerted him that there was something serious that was being processed related to the contracts and to the concession. The signatures of the ministers were being collected, and that led me to think about what happened further on. And then the reaction of Mr. Zan. I clearly remember that he was a few minutes away from going into another meeting, another high-level meeting with the government officials, and his comments showed that he was very surprised and shocked because what I was telling him did not agree with in the next meeting that he was going to go into, which was a high-level negotiation-like meeting.
Then in paragraph 9, you mentioned that in the following months you were informed that the meetings of the high-level commission had failed to resolve the differences. So again, permit me to ask a couple of questions about that paragraph. First, were you the person or persons that informed you about the failure of the meetings to resolve the differences, was that the same high-level source or another reputable person? And second, did you have any more information during the subsequent months about what the nature of the differences between the two parties was that had been unresolved?
The first answer, no.
Was it the same person, and if not, was it another reputable official? Who told you, who informed you that the meetings failed to resolve the differences?
The conclusion that the meetings had failed to resolve the difference, well, no one told me that. I was a witness to that. So the answer to your first question is no. The person that informed this to me initially had nothing to do with this. This is something that I lived through and that I was able to see firsthand. The second question was if the nature of the deficiencies that were left unresolved, well, if I know of the nature of those deficiencies that remained unresolved, well, my answer to your question is, well, I know this is related to the 3 contracts because I've heard of them number of times. At least I understood it was 3 contracts, but I am not privy to the details. Was this because of the right-of-way, of the rolling stock, or of the right-of-way? I don't know. But what I do know is that without these 3 components, the railway project cannot become operational. So the differences related to these 3 contracts were left unresolved. There were differences. That was my understanding in connection with those 3 contracts. Each one of these 3 contracts had unresolved issues, and both parties had to come to an agreement in connection with that. I don't know if I'm answering your question or not.
Sir, I've served my government as a mediator in the same way you were serving your government as a mediator here. You obviously knew as a mediator the general nature of the 3 contracts, the 143, 158 with respect to rolling stock, the 802 with respect to the trust fund, the 402 in terms of the rehabilitation. I mean, you knew the sort of general purposes of those contracts. Is that correct? In order to be an effective mediator, you certainly had to educate yourself about those, and I'm sure you did.
I just wanted to clarify things, and I want to say that this is important for my professional honor. it is a bit unfair to be a negotiator, a 24-hour negotiator, where one has to negotiate on behalf of a government something that has been in the makings for many, many years, one, and two, not to have the time and resources to do things. The word negotiator used here is very elegant. It's a very elegant word. This implied a lot of technical responsibility. What the president wanted to do this, as we say in Guatemala, please try and solve this problem amongst the parties involved. Who are the technical people? Well, the technical people are the people from FEGUA and the Ministry of Communications, etc. And the gentleman from RDC and Ferrodías, well, Mr. Jorge Sen. So the president came up to me and said, okay, try and have both parties meet and solve this problem. I wanted to put my professional prestige in a safe place, if you will. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Yes, it's certainly safe with this tribunal, I can assure you that. Let me stipulate, if I may,
Thank you very much.
my humble understanding. The Lesivo Declaration was made with respect to contracts 143 and 158, which were dealing with the rolling stock and had the, at least as we understand it, the deficiencies of not having a public bid and not having been properly ratified by the executive. Now, during your discussions, negotiations, mediation, were you aware that these were the deficiencies with respect to which the Lesivo Declaration was aimed? And was there an effort to correct those specific deficiencies?
These are two questions wrapped up into one. The first is, did I know about the deficiencies? No. And the things you explained? No, I didn't have the faintest idea. I only knew the project in general terms. I was just trying to facilitate communication between the parties. The second part of your question, did I try subsequently to cure those deficiencies and differences? Well, I think it would be very late for me to start working on those issues. What I was trying to do was to solve the issues. I wanted the parties to then go back, if you will, take a step back and say, okay, there's no lesividad, and that's what I did, but not technically, if you will.
Slightly different. Did the government try to correct during these discussions? Did they try to ask that these two deficiencies be corrected? Not what you yourself did, but to your knowledge, did the government try to correct these two deficiencies?
No.
That is not my understanding, and that is not my personal knowledge.
Professor Crawford asked you a question about paragraph 12, and I just want to have myself a better understanding, because he's a professor and I'm not, so I need to go over this a second time. The Lesivo Declaration was contrary to the interests of the country, you say. Why did you, I want to have a better understanding of why you felt that to be the case.
My intention from the beginning, and this is set forth in my first statement, has always been, and it is still, for a country to have railways, developed railways. Now, to say this is Lesivo, well, it's very easy to understand that this is going to prevent the development of railways in my country. Even today, this is going to be very difficult. It's going to be very difficult to resume this issue. That is what I meant when I said that this was going against the interest of the country. I think the moral issues and the legal issues that are wrapped into a lesividad, well, that's very difficult, and it should have been avoided at all cost.
Although you were a mediator, you also had a senior position in terms of major projects, and although you said this didn't technically fit within that, it was obviously, as you said, of strategic importance. Is that correct?
Es correcto.
That is correct.
Explain to me, as a senior official, why would it have been in the interests of a government to, as you said in your second part of paragraph 12, to design a strategy to declare a contract lesivo dealing with rolling stock to prevent further rendering of railroad services? What would the interests of the government of Guatemala be in that kind of outcome? Again, you were part of the government. Why would they have had an interest in that?
The origin of the concession, and I'm going to take a few moments to explain this. I'm going to make my best effort without being an expert. The origin of the concession of railways in our country dates back to 2 administrations ago. It is important to point out that the railway has been an icon of development in many countries. So there's a parallel between the development of a country and the development of the railway. Unfortunately, in our country, we have had a railway plagued with disputes that are both political and commercial in nature. If you look at the history of railway, we have gone from private hands to public hands and vice versa for a long time. So to think that a government, and I'm trying to answer your question, is interested in declaring lesividad, well, honestly, the government of President Verger initially had no interest in declaring lesividad. Now, the deadlines started coming up, and because of good or bad luck of this government, there was a date set. And the government had to say, we will declare lesividad or we will not declare lesividad. Why was I participating in all this? Because I always thought, well, if we have goodwill from both parties, we can prevent lesividad if the parties agree to their differences. But I did not have enough time to do so, and unfortunately, lesividad was declared. If you allow me to say one more thing very briefly, well, I don't know about these arbitration proceedings. This is absolutely a new experience for me in my life. What I'm going to say now, I'm not going to say as a witness, but as a Guatemalan citizen, regardless of the decision that this tribunal is going to make, and it doesn't matter whether one party wins or one party loses, what I would like to say is to share with you what many Guatemalan citizens wish, which is that we hope that after this and after the arbitration award, we're going to be able to take up this issue of building a railway and to be able to overcome, both on the part of RDC and the government, to overcome obstacles and for us to be able to have both a cargo and a passenger railroad.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate the sentiments, and I appreciate your very candid statement. But permit me again, if you could look at the actual wording in the second part of the paragraph 12. You mentioned that the government had already designed a strategy that involved declaring of the usufruct contract for the rolling stock Lesivo as a way to prevent FVG from further rendering railroad services, and consequently give the government sufficient legal grounds to terminate the other two usufruct contracts. Why, in your opinion, again, as a government official, as well as a mediator or negotiator, would they have developed such a strategy? What would have been the benefit from their standpoint of having such a strategy? Because if as you said yourself, you felt that this would be the end of the railroad. So to explain to the tribunal why they would, from your opinion, have designed such a strategy, which you've set forth here.
That is the question that I was trying to answer, that I have always been trying to answer, and I do not have a legal answer that could be convincing to you, but I will try to answer in the following manner. If fulfilling a deadline to be able to declare the contract lesivo was a priority and also more of a concern for the General Secretary so as to protect the President of the Republic, which I can fully understand, I didn't think it was strong enough to say that's the only reason, therefore let's go ahead and fulfill the program, the project, and we need to declare lesivo. Therefore, based on my understanding, it was necessary to have a smart strategy to say if I am able to declare lesivo one of the contracts, that contract will not be able to be fulfilled, and it is legitimate for the country to say, I am going to declare this lesivo. Which of the two parties is right? I do not know, because the government is acting in good faith, trying or attempting to fulfill their role. There is no bad faith, in my opinion, but on the same token, I think that Ferrovias has the same right to say that this cannot be punished because this was not done at that pace. And I think that this case goes beyond a private company that acquires a public service with due respect to Ferrovias. This has to do with how the laws need to be applied and the rule of law, if you allow me to say it in your own language. This is the key of the matter, because today this is the issue, but tomorrow it could be any other contract with any other company or for any other service where the people from Guatemala may say we'd like to have better service or a better product, but no company in the world will be interested in investing in our country because of the consequences that this may have.
Set of questions that, regardless of whether you develop the notes or not, it's quite obvious from your responses that the several meetings in which you participated involved all three of the major contracts, not just the contract to which Lesividad was applied. It looks like there was an effort at what I would call a global agreement on all three. Is that your understanding, that they were trying to resolve all three of these, not just the technical defects with respect to 143 and 158?
Yes, it is correct.
In your second statement, in the end of paragraph 9, you mentioned that the proposals were designed to have Ferrovias surrender a considerable part of the property and rights granted to them involving real estate. They would have to return certain unused property. And this is your understanding of the government's demand? Is that the case?
En el párrafo 9 de
At paragraph 9 of the first statement,
But of what the demand was from the government, going back to October 24th, to August 24th, but continuing forward.
mi entendimiento,
my understanding, as I said at paragraph 9, was not to offer an opportunity. Let's forget about lesividad, let's move forward. It's either this or nothing. There was no room like the one I would like to have as a negotiator to determine what of the three contracts is not being fulfilled and what can we do to fulfill the contract. But if the deadline is tomorrow, the goodwill is over and this is what happened.
It was tried to have Ferrovias sign a settlement agreement whereby the company would surrender a considerable part of its rights as usufructuary of real property, just like they did the day before the publication of the Declaration of Lesividad. So is it your understanding that there was an effort to, that this was the government's demand? Was this the government's demand as part of, you said sign, 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 sign. Is this what they wanted Ferrovias to sign?
yo entendí siempre
I always understood that it was a position with no flexibility. It was my way or nothing. So if you'd like to avoid future problems, lesividad, etc., we need to sign this. And I also understood, on the other hand, that if there is lesividad, it will be very difficult to develop this project later on.
This would be a settlement agreement about surrendering their rights and so forth, as you say in paragraph 9. Is that what they were demanding?
correcto.
Okay.
Correct.
And one last question, which is at the very end of that paragraph. You say, in other words, none of the parties focused on removing the grounds of lesividad of the contract involving equipment. So you're saying basically that neither party seemed focused on correcting the problems that led to lesividad. Neither side. Is that what you're saying in this last sentence?
¿De qué declaración?
What statement? The first one or the second one?
Paragraph 9, the paragraph we've been talking about.
Mhm.
I'm sorry. Pardon me. I thought it was a carryover. It's paragraph 10. It's the concluding numbered paragraph on your second statement.
Permítame leerla rápidamente.
Let me read it quickly.
Sí, es correcto. No,
Yes, it is correct. No one focused on the reasons or the grounds in the three contracts for lesividad. Both positions were stalled. Either you give me this or nothing. And the other one was in the same situation. That is not the reason that could technically lead to lesividad. The agendas were not really different, and therefore I could see that there was no possibility to carry out any negotiation, and that was the end of the story.
Gracias.
Mr. Foster, any questions on the matters raised by our questions?
No, sir.
Mr. Horta?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Fuentes, I'd like to take you to your first declaration, paragraph 12. You were asked about that by the tribunal. First declaration. I think that's the, maybe that's the second one. Maybe you have the second one up on the screen. We need the first one. And it is paragraph 12. You were asked about that. Thank you.
¿Podemos proyectarla en español?
Can we see it in Spanish?
We're going to put it up in English, but you should have in front of you. Well, actually, I think you drafted this in English, if I'm not mistaken. I don't believe we have a Spanish version of it.
Okay. Adelante.
Please go ahead.
So, first of all, this conversation that you mentioned you had with Mr. Arroyave, he is the Secretary General of the President. Would you characterize him as a close advisor to the President?
Of course.
Did you hear the answer? Okay, thank you. What Mr. Arroyave told you, he told you that in his legal opinion, the President had to make the Lesivo Declaration to avoid potential future legal consequences. Is that correct?
Objection. This is the one sentence in the paragraph that the arbitrators did not ask Mr. Fuentes about.
If you'd like, I can respond, but he was asked about the meeting and what the conversation he had with Mr. Arroyave, and to single parcel out of context that conversation is, I think, silly. I'm allowed to ask him about it, and he was asked about it.
I mean, if it's necessary, I'll ask him the question so he can respond, okay? So why don't you just let him answer the question?
Go ahead.
Would you like me to re-ask the question?
Por favor.
Okay. So
Please.
in this meeting, the Secretary General told you that in his legal opinion, the President had to sign the Lesivo Declaration in order to avoid any potential future legal consequences. Is that correct?
Es correcto.
That is correct.
Did he say anything more? Can you expand upon that, or is that all that you recall about that?
No, solo estoy respondiendo.
I'm just answering your question. Whether Mr. Arroyave had told me that he had said that, and that's what we just read. And that is correct. Yes, it is correct.
Do you recall him saying anything more other than just that statement about did he tell you what legal consequences the President would incur in, for example, if he didn't proceed with the Lesivo Declaration?
No, no recuerdo.
No, I don't remember. I just remember what you see there basically was that the President may have some sort of impact in the future and it is necessary to do it. And if that is the motivation behind it, I understand it and I do not share it as I stated it there.
If the contract was not declared Lesivo by the 25th of August, if it wasn't published, I should say, the Lesivo Declaration by the 25th of August, that the government would forever lose its right to challenge that contract under Guatemalan law? Did he say that to you?
Algo así, no podría.
Something to that effect. I am not a lawyer and I cannot ascertain that that is the case, but more or less that is what I heard. There was a time to be able to declare lesividad.
You were asked some questions. I'm sorry, just if we can. Going to the end of paragraph 12, Professor Crawford asked you about the ending of paragraph 12, and in it you say that Mr. Arroyave told you that the government designed a strategy involving declaring the usufruct rolling stock lesivo as a way to prevent FEG from further rendering railway services and consequently giving the government sufficient legal grounds to terminate the other usufruct contracts. As we sit here today, do you know if the government has terminated the other usufruct contracts?
Lo que yo escuché
What I heard is exactly what I wrote. And your question is whether today?
Know whether the government has followed through, assuming that that in fact was a strategy the government had, do you know whether the government has followed through with what Mr. Arroyave told you, which is to terminate the other two usufruct contracts between FVG and FEGUA? Has the government done that, to your knowledge?
Yes. It was declared lesivo.
Question is whether the government terminated the other two contracts, that not the one that was declared lesivo, which is the equipment contract, but the other two contracts that were not declared lesivo. Do you know whether the government has taken action to terminate those agreements, as you say it was reported to you by Mr. Arroyave?
no, y sería incongruente.
It would be inconsistent because it was not the duty of the government to do so, but I do not know.
Secretary Eisenstadt, whether during the negotiations the government ever tried to or expressed opinions about wanting to cure the lesivo or the causes that made the contracts lesivo. Do you recall that?
La pregunta o mi
Are you asking me if I remember the question or the answer? Yes.
Paul telling Secretary Eisenstadt that the government, to your knowledge, never during those meetings brought up the issue of curing the causes that made the contracts lesivo. That's what you told him.
Yes.
Let's put up C44, Clause 6. And, sir, this document you do have in your notebook under tab C44 in Spanish, if you would like to read the Spanish version, but for purposes of the tribunal, we have the English version up on the screen. And if we could highlight all of Clause 6, go all the way down to where it says 7th. Please. This is the, just to refresh your recollection, this is the document that was handed to, you say, Ferrovias on the day before, on 24 August 2006, the day before the government published the lesivo declaration. And one of the clauses in here, Clause 6, reads, issues to be settled in connection with onerous usufruct contract involving railway equipment owned by Ferrocarriles de Guatemala. And under A of Clause 6, it says, modifications to the onerous usufruct contract involving railway equipment in order to rectify the terms which are deemed to cause lesion to the interests of the state of Guatemala, according to the opinion rendered by the Solicitor General's Office, Ferrocarriles de Guatemala, and the Ministry of Public Finance. So, in this draft contract that was presented to them, it appears that the government was offering, at that point in time, to negotiate with Ferrovias to resolve the reasons that made the contract lesivo as set forth in the 3 opinions that are mentioned in this agreement. Isn't that right?
No sé, porque
I don't know, because I do not have the technical knowledge. If you're saying that, I have to confirm it, but I am not the one who, from the technical point of view, did it. And based on what I heard from both parties, I said, okay, we are not reaching an agreement. I am not interested in what you are saying, or we should not change what you are saying should be changed. And
even read this document before it was handed over to the other side. But as you're reading it now, it certainly looks like the government was offering to negotiate to rectify the causes that made the contract lesivo. That's what this says, isn't that right?
tendría que leerlo y
I need to read it and study it to be able to give you my opinion.
Let's go, if we can, please, to R36. And if we could go to you already have it highlighted, if you can just go Monday, August 28th. We went through this before, but Secretary Eisenstadt also asked you about whether after the contract was rendered lesivo and the lesivo declaration was published, whether the government, during those meetings that took place after, ever tried to address the issues that made the contract lesivo. And I believe you responded to him that the government didn't do that. Now, under the meeting notes from August 28th, bullet point under point 5, bullet point number 4, it in fact says that there were discussions during that meeting about executing a new contract for the usufruct of the railway equipment, considering the lesivo declaration of the previous contract. Correct?
yo no es
I did not write these minutes.
I'm saying based on the recollection of the person who wrote this document, it says during the meeting that's an issue that was discussed. Isn't that right?
cuál
What topic? You are confusing me because you are giving me a lot of information, so please ask me a more specific question. What topic was addressed at what meeting, and I am going to answer.
28, Monday, August 28. It looks, according to this, if this is correct, the parties did discuss the issue of executing a new contract to deal with the lesivo causes. Isn't that right?
no recuerdo
I don't remember whether it was the lesivo issue, but it was what had not been solved between the parties.
Recall. You don't have a recollection that differs from what is recorded in these notes, do you?
28
August 28th? Please repeat your question. Lesividad had already happened.
Certainty that whoever put these notes together was wrong, and that as a matter of fact, the parties did not discuss fixing the causes that make the contract lesivo, as reflected in this point. Can you say with certainty that did not happen?
What I can say with certainty is that I did not write this. I cannot say whether the content is wrong or not. I can say that the meeting took place based on the agenda and that these topics were discussed.
I know I'm running a little short on time, but these are points that directly were asked by Secretary Eisenstadt, so I think it's important. Just going to R37 to finish with this line of questioning. You testified before that you recall, and this is R37, you also have, if you need to look at it, the Spanish version of the document.
gracias lo veo
Thank you, I can see it.
Contract number 143, usufruct of railroad equipment. You testified before that you remember that Mr. Sen said during these meetings that he didn't think it was advisable to draft a new contract and that he thought that that was, in terms of the railway equipment, and that he thought that that was of secondary priority, correct?
Objection. Asked and answered. He covered this exact question in his original cross-examination.
This is going directly to his answer to Secretary Eisenstadt in the tribunal that this issue was not discussed during the meetings. And if you'll allow me to ask my question, you'll see I think it'll help to elucidate that.
Ask the question first.
Thank you. Now, sir, can you explain to us if the issue of drafting a new contract to correct the Lesivo declaration causes was not discussed during these meetings, why would Jorge Sen be saying that it wasn't necessary to draft a new contract and that it was of secondary priority?
Objection. He's asking him to speculate on why Mr. Sen did something. That's ridiculous.
It's an incredibly fair question. He recalls that Mr. Sen said that it wasn't necessary to draft a new contract, but at the same time he tells Secretary Eisenstadt that the issue wasn't even discussed. It makes no sense, and he needs to explain that.
I think what Mr. Sen thought is a different matter.
But he, okay, well, let me rephrase the question then. You did testify earlier that Mr. Sen, you have a recollection that Mr. Sen said these things, correct? You told us that earlier.
Mhm.
Okay. Can you explain to Secretary Eisenstadt and the rest of the tribunal how it is or why it is, if you know, that Mr. Sen would be talking about this issue if the issue never came up during the meetings?
Same objection.
I said if you know.
He can't possibly know what was in Mr. Sen's mind. I mean, there is a way to ask the question. I'm not going to tell him how to do it.
Well, just ask him whether or not this did come up during the meetings, as reflected in the minutes.
Thank you, Secretary Eisenstadt, for the help. Do you recall that this came up during the meetings, this issue of the new contract to
Sí.
resolve the Lesivo?
Yes.
Es que ahí
There I have some doubt. I don't know whether it was to cure lesividad causes, but there was an interest to address the issue of Lesivo, and Mr. Sen's position was that that was not important or fundamental, but that is vaguely what I remember.
Discussed that a new equipment contract had to be elaborated given the fact that the other contract had been declared Lesivo. You recall that?
repítame.
Please repeat your question, but in simpler terms.
Es un juego de
This is a game with questions, and I am getting confused. Could you please ask me a more simple question?
You do recall that during the meetings, post-Lesivo, where the parties were getting together to discuss a possible settlement, that the issue of drafting a new contract for the railroad equipment came up, given that the other contract had been declared Lesivo. Correct?
Yes. But I cannot link both questions. You have two questions there, and I do not remember.
Not on this topic. But it does go to another issue that Secretary Eisenstadt asked you about. He pointed you to paragraph 9 of your second declaration and paragraph 10 of your second declaration. I want to focus you in on paragraph 9 and ask you something that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me about your testimony. So if we can put up paragraph 9. It's not up on the screen yet. There we go. Thank you. In the minutes of the meetings that took place post-Lesivo, you mentioned to us earlier in your testimony that the parties were discussing the possibility of reprogramming the phases for rehabilitating the railway. You remember that? You have to answer verbally.
Sí.
Yes, I'm sorry, yes. Y usted
In your declaration and in response to the questions by Secretary Eisenstadt that the government was insisting on having certain land or that land in which the restoration would occur returned to the government.
¿Es correcto?
That's correct.
To us how it is or why it is that the government would be talking to Ferrovías about reprogramming its restoration phases so as to continue with the restoration while at the same time demanding that the land be given back?
No.
No, I cannot.
With your permission, Mr. President, one last, more of just an interest. Going back to your much earlier testimony about Mr. Pinto's interest, you mentioned that it was because of the sugar industry. What did you understand Mr. Pinto's relationship was to the sugar industry? Did he represent them in some way, or did he have an interest of some kind that was disclosed to you with regard to the sugar industry?
Absolutamente, 100%.
Yes, 100%. The answer is yes to both. I know that Hector Pinto worked his whole life for the sugar industry. His call was to talk about the interests of the sugar industry and to see what path or what vision the railway had that could benefit the work of the sugar industry in our country.
With reference to the South Coast extension of the line?
Absolutamente.
Yes.
Mr. Pinto's interest in the extension of that line.
Pues yo no diría que...
Well, I wouldn't say Mr. Pinto's interest, but rather for the country, I would say it's important to have an alternative means of transportation for the logistics of sugar, which is concentrated in the southern coast. About 95% of the sugar mills are along the southern coast, and the main port for the export is also on the Pacific, on the southern coast. So I imagine that for them, the interest is a major logistical commercial interest. But I'm talking about the interest of the sugar agro industry. Now, what is or what was Mr. Pinto's interest or his client's particular interest, or the interest of his particular client? I don't know. I could assume or intuit, but it would be speculation on my part.
You mentioned a project called Ciudad del Sur.
Sí, claro.
Yes, of course, I'm perfectly familiar with it.
Pinto's discussion with you about Ciudad del Sur.
Como el
How the question of the railroad might make sense and have synergy with the project that they've developed over many years in Ciudad del Sur.
You understand controlled Ciudad del Sur.
The owners of the farms where Ciudad del Sur is located. I don't know exactly who they are. I presume, based on what we all know in our country, who it might be. But I could not say it was a specific person, first name, last name, because I don't have personal knowledge of who the owners are, other than what I'm generally familiar with.
Mr. Pinto had an interest in this particular project.
Sí, esa
Yes, that was my impression.
con mucho gusto.
Yes. With pleasure.
Nothing further.
Nothing from the respondent.
So, Mr. Fuentes, thank you so much. Se puede retirar.
You may step down. Thank you very much. Thank you. Good evening.
Could we have a word with council? We are going to adjourn now, as it was foreseen. It was going to be from 2 to 6. and we'll see you all tomorrow morning at 9. So have a good evening.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.